As I was working on this presentation, updating it, refining it, it occurred to me that the audience I had in mind was President-elect Trump, who I don't believe has even heard the phrase women, peace, and security in his life, and would not know what it meant. And I felt deeply that I wanted to make that case. Now, I realize that it's kind of silly to make that case in front of all of you, because I think you probably accept that case. However, why don't we go ahead and see what that case is? Let's revisit that case. And from there, we're going to go directly then into the first panel, and we will hear first from Secretary James, who has honored us with her presence today. We're so grateful for her being here. All right. Now, last year, we had an event which was mostly a large event with people from the East Coast. And one of the people who came was Donald Steinberg. He used to be Deputy Administrator of USAID and is now President of World Learning. And he said something that day that has struck me and continues to strike me. He said, compare those societies that respect women and those which don't. Who's trafficking in weapons and drugs? Who's harboring terrorists and starting pandemics? Whose problems require US troops on the ground? There's a one-to-one correspondence. Don't tell me there's no relationship between national security and the empowerment of women. Now, you may say, well, Donald Steinberg, he's just one voice. And yet, even 10 years ago, we had the UN Secretary General saying something like, the world is starting to grasp that there is no policy more effective in promoting development, health, and education than the empowerment of women and girls. I think we know that. But he went on to say, and I would venture that no policy is more important in preventing conflict or in achieving reconciliation after a conflict has ended. And that is something that has been new for our age. Those links to health and education have been established for a long period of time. But the link to security, women, peace, and security, is only now beginning to be articulated. And so we are here today to begin to assemble a group of Texas stakeholders interested in women, peace, and security. And we wanted to convene them in discussion with national level policymakers such as Secretary James. And Secretary James, let me just say right in front of my dean that I hope we can bring you back in the future to impart to our students the wisdom that you have learned from your time in your position. And I also want to make the claim, and this is a claim that the Compton Foundation found, I think, very interesting, is that women, peace, and security is not a blue state issue, even though it has traditionally been associated with the East Coast. I believe that there are many in red states like Texas that are deeply committed to the women, peace, and security agenda, and you see some of them around this table today. So now more than ever, and again, I'm referencing the election, the participation of red state stakeholders in this national level dialogue is going to be key. And we need to amplify their voices through collective effort. And hopefully we can begin and start that today. So what I would like to go through is sort of a list of how women are linked to peace and security. And let me start by talking about food security for a nation. All right? We know, actually, that women produce most of the world's food. And in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, they perform about 80% of agricultural labor, over 50% worldwide. And yet, worldwide, women own a very tiny percentage of arable land. All right? Land and being a man goes together in many cultures. And I'm not just talking about sub-Saharan Africa. For example, in communist China, studies have been done that show that arable land passes from father to son, or father to cousin, or father to nephew. It virtually never ends up in the hands of women. All right? The FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, calculates that if women farmers were given the same assistance as male farmers, malnutrition would drop 17% in the very next year, which is a stunning figure. all right? So women's property rights are associated with the degree of nutrition of their children. We also know that remuneration for cash crops is often given to the head of the household, the man, who owns the land. However, World Bank studies have shown us 95% of a woman's earnings go to her family, but only 40 to 60% of a man's earnings go to his family. Furthermore, women suffer from a deep time poverty. Women are expected to process and cook food, find fuel and potable water, on top of all of their other responsibilities, not just for children, but also for agricultural labor. So one of the deepest forms of underdevelopment is the time poverty of women. Furthermore, if we look worldwide at malnourished children, 2/3 of malnourished children are female children, right? In many areas of the world, women and girls are expected to eat later than men and boys and have less access to protein that their body needs. Furthermore, in many agricultural societies, it is women who are responsible to see that women and children are fed, all right, and do not starve. Men may actually find it deeply culturally shameful to help their wives and don't assist them, even though study after study has shown that men who help their wives with agricultural labor end up with larger harvests. So to culminate this kind of research, I think we can ask, might inequitable treatment of women make famine and malnutrition more likely for a nation? And the answer is absolutely yes. Well, we can turn also to economic prosperity in women. And there, the World Bank has done a pioneering series of studies looking at the linkages there. So they use a measure called the gender gap. The larger the gender gap, the worse the treatment of women. The smaller the gender gap, the better the treatment of women. And they found the larger the gender gap, the lower the GDP per capita of the nation, and the lower the rate of national economic growth. Okay? When you sort of prohibit women from being a viable and equal part of the labor force, that's what you're going to get. They also discovered lower investment in female education is linked to lower national income. Where you keep half of your population in comparative ignorance, that's what you get. Furthermore, they did a broad Cochrane-esque-like meta-analysis of their development projects over the last 2 decades. And what they discovered is that those projects that they had funded that had an explicit gender component were more successful in hitting their evaluation benchmarks than those that did not. Very telling. And then last year, McKinsey & Company, the financial research firm, undertook a fascinating study in which they found, let me quote here, if they looked at what was called a full potential scenario in which women participate in the economy identically to men, and they found that would add up to $28 trillion, or an increase of 26% to annual global GDP by 2025, compared with what they called a business as usual scenario. They said this impact is roughly equivalent to the size of the combined Chinese and US economies today. Furthermore, they looked at an alternative best in region scenario where countries at least rose to the best country in their region. And if that's the case, that adds at least 12 trillion in 2025 GDP, equivalent in size to the current GDP of Germany, Japan, and the UK combined. So I think it's pertinent to ask the question, might inequitable treatment of women make poverty and lower levels of prosperity more likely for the nation? Yeah, yes it will. Health in women is kind of a no-brainer, all right? We know this, all right? The smaller the gender gap, the lower the infant and child mortality rates, and the lower the level of child malnutrition in a society. When you empower women, you empower them to take better care of the children, the future. So the comment that the armor officer made, I would say that women also assure your security, all right? Also assure your future in a way, because they're the ones who are investing primarily in those children in many societies. The smaller the gender gap, the lower the share of household income spent on cigarettes and alcohol. When women have a voice in household decision-making, those decisions change. The larger the gender gap, the higher the AIDS rate, the higher the infectious disease burden rate. And lastly, the larger the gender gap, the lower the life expectancy, not just for women, but for men as well. Okay? So inequitable treatment of women makes disease and ill health and all of the economic consequences of that much more likely for the nation state. Now, to get to my bailiwick, okay, my field of study is looking at women and security, particularly conflict and associated phenomena. We found some very interesting findings. The higher the level of violence against women in a society, we found the more likely a nation state is to be non-compliant with international norms and its own treaty obligations. Furthermore, overall, the nation will behave much less peacefully in the international system. Specifically, for example, the higher the level of violence against women, the worse a nation-state's relations with its neighbors. Mary Caprioli of the University of Minnesota has done some path-breaking research that shows the larger the gender gap, the more likely a nation is to be involved in inter- and intrastate conflict and to use violent force first in that conflict. So the norms of conflict resolution between men and women in the society spill over and affect the norms of conflict resolution even at the state level. Furthermore, in more focused research, we found that, for example, violence against women as manifested in sex-selective abortion and female infanticide can have real security effects. So China is facing a situation where within just a few years, they are estimated they will have 50 million more young adult men than women in their society. 50 million more. It's a 15% gap. And certainly, what we've found is that this fuels violent crime, instability, and even the potential for regional conflict. Because you're going to look at a war of attrition differently in that circumstance than you would otherwise. My most recent article, which is under review at International Security, looks at bride prices. In many societies, marriage is more of an economic exchange. And bride price, or the price that a groom and his family must pay to the bride's father to get a bride, can be a real cause of conflict within the society. We've done case studies of South Sudan and northern Nigeria, and we found that as bride price rose, levels of conflict rose, and it became much easier for rebel groups and terrorist groups to recruit young men into their ranks, as young men were absolutely unable to marry in the face of surging bride prices. These are things that we don't usually look at in an international security class, but which I argue we should. So might inequitable treatment of women make conflict more likely for your nation state? Yes, yes, yes. Governance in women is an area that we're just starting to get into, and there's some fascinating research that exists. The larger the gender gap, the higher the levels of perceived and actual government corruption. The smaller the gender gap, the greater the level of trust in government, the greater the transparency in government. Furthermore, the IPU, the Interparliamentary Union, has done some fascinating research that shows that when you have a higher representation of women in your national parliament, you have a higher percentage of your legislation dealing with social welfare, fighting corruption, and legal protections for citizens, which are three things that women know on a day-to-day basis are problematic in their own lives. And then lastly, some of my former students who are now getting PhDs, one of my former students is at Yale getting her PhD, and she found that when women are represented in peace negotiations, right, in sufficient numbers, participants are more satisfied with the outcome, and the agreement is significantly more durable. It lasts longer. So, might inequitable treatment of women make poor governance more likely? Yes. Demographics in women is another one of those does. You know, you need women to have children, and therefore demographics is going to be critically dependent on the character of male-female relations within the society. So what we find is where marriage is highly inequitable between men and women, where women cannot negotiate the terms of sexual intercourse, you end up with unsustainably high levels of population growth. And we know that these kind of youth bulges play a large role in interstate conflict and stress. On the other side, right, when society makes it economically irrational for women to have children by punishing mothers in the workplace, as we see in places such as Japan and other places, I should throw in the US here with its stunning lack of any paid maternity leave. Hopefully that will change, we'll see. You get sub-replacement birth rates. Does Japan see its stunningly low birth rate as a national security problem? You betcha. Absolutely it does. Again, see how the dysfunctional character of male-female relations within the society spills over into the security realm. And furthermore, I think it is, I am still thunderstruck by this statistic. In an overall sense, natural sex ratios should be about 98 men per 100 women, because women tend to live longer than men. The overall sex ratio of our world, of our planet today, is 101.4. But you might say that's a few percentage points. No, no, no. Think about that in terms of over 9 billion people and how many missing women that indicates. Okay? Serious, destabilizing ramifications come from that situation. For example, when I first started studying birth-sex ratios, in 1990 we found 5 countries that had abnormal birth-sex ratios, and all of them were in Asia. Today, there are 19, and arguably, actually I think Beverly will point out, it's more like 24 nations with abnormal birth-sex ratios favoring males. This is a truly global gendercide, and its effects on all sorts of dimensions of security have never been plumbed. Hopefully we'll hear more from Beverly on that situation. Might inequitable treatment of women make demographic problems more likely? Yes, absolutely. So what I would like to sum up here, and starting to say, is that oftentimes I'm asked, Professor Hudson, women are the canary in the coal mine. You know, what's going on with women is just a symptom, it's just an effect of what's happening with, a lack of democratization or scarcity of resources or ethnic issues. And I say, after almost a quarter century of studying this, I would tell you that women are not the canary, okay? The character of male-female relations in a society is the coal mine. And the canaries which squawk and then fall over dead, right, are actually, right, poverty, malnutrition, ill health, explosive violence, demographic problems, and so forth, right? And this, I think, is the conceptual difference that is wrought by having women, peace, and security lenses on when you look at security issues. I still think Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, former Secretary of State, said this most succinctly when she said, "The subjugation of women is a threat to the common security of our world and the national security of our country." We have a National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security that was promulgated in the year 2011. What I want to know from a President-elect Trump is what will be the fate of that National Action Plan. And I think Debbie's going to talk a little bit more about that. So I think we have a number of issues facing women in my book, Sex and World Peace. We look specifically at 3, and I'll run over these very quickly because I only have about 12 minutes left to me. We look specifically at the physical insecurity of women, inequitable family law favoring men, and lack of parity in the councils of human decision-making. So when we talk about the physical insecurity of women, we have a wide variety of phenomena that we could examine. Everything from sex-selective abortion to higher rates of childhood malnutrition, maternal mortality, pervasive domestic violence, even in countries that you would think would be paradise for women. Most people, when we say paradise for women, think Sweden. 25% of Swedish women have experienced domestic violence. That's the best the species appears to be able to do at this point. That's a stunning indictment. And so we must ask, when is peacetime for women? And where is peacetime if the most dangerous place for a woman is actually in her home? And where even if she goes outside, the harassment that she will face in public spaces is daunting. We could look at all the others: rape, femicide, sex trafficking, honor crimes, lack of consent in marriage and childbearing, the plight of widows, lots of facets of women's insecurity. We could also look at inequitable family law. In many countries, women remain legal minors for their entire life. When they are in their father's home, he is their guardian, and she is a minor to him. When she gets married, she is still a legal minor, and she may have to have permission to go to school, to travel, to work. Women's property rights we've also alluded to, but women are often also shortchanged in inheritance. Marriage laws and customs may be deeply inequitable and harming to women. Polygamy, patriarchality, bride price, and so forth. Divorce and child custody. It may be very easy for a man to divorce a woman. I divorce you, said 3 times. But for a woman, she might have to prove 7 years abandonment. She might have to prove that her husband is mentally ill. The barriers for women to obtain a divorce are so high in many cultures. And similarly, child custody often always reverts to the husband in many patrilocal cultures. Sex. In our database, we have a list of over 80 countries where marital rape is not considered as a crime. It seems like an oxymoron in these particular cultures. Many women have no right to refuse sex or use family planning. There may be double standards of marital fidelity, where a woman may be killed if there's even a suspicion that she has been unfaithful, whereas a man may be applauded for his unfaithfulness in marriage. Lack of parity in decision-making. Well, even though it's an improvement over the turn of the century when we only had 14% female participation in national legislatures, we're up to, yahoo, after 16 years, we're up to 22%. At that rate, it will take us well into the next century in order to have equal participation of women. And so other things are worth talking about: the global system of national accounts, whereby GDP is calculated, do not include any unpaid caregiving or reproductive work performed by women. And that distorts our economic policy big time. We know the workplace, the modern workplace, is designed around an archetypal male worker. So Anne-Marie Slaughter and others have talked about how can a woman have it all right? And all of the contortions that she must go through to have it all. And all this despite the fact that research has shown that mixed gender groups make less risky decisions, are more creative and more commutarian in their solutions, and participants are far more likely to be satisfied with the outcome when women have participated in the decision. We even have a multinational survey of 6,500 firms that show where women had greater representation on corporate boards, those organizations were much less likely to be hit by scandals like bribery and like fraud. Adding women makes sense. So, again, oftentimes when I get into debates with my security studies compatriots, certainly not the ones represented in the room, Professor Ross, you are exempt, but when I've gotten into debates with others, such as, for example, Barry Posen, who's coming very soon to our campus, and they say, Valerie, you know, what does this have to do with the national interest? All right, what does this have to do with realism and realpolitik? And I say, give me a break. whether we're examining the national interest in terms of the durability of peace accords, food security, security demographics, national health, national wealth, quality of governance, interstate relations and conflict, any other aspect of security. Women's empowerment helps in tangible ways. And that's the Women, Peace, and Security agenda in a nutshell. Now, I will tell you that that's Women, Peace, and Security 101. And that's the talk that you all probably already know, but I wish President-elect Trump knew. But for those of you in the room, let me just say that those 4 years when Secretary Clinton was in charge of the State Department, we learned a few lessons. And that's why I co-wrote a book called The Hillary Doctrine that looked at those 4 years of time. And what we discovered is that it was not a cakewalk. And I know that those of you who were serving in the Obama administration during his time in office could probably relate to a number of these things. For example, Secretary of Clinton never once took the Saudis to task for their treatment of women. Never once said boo to the Chinese about their levels of sex-selective abortion. All right? She did so because she preferred to raise it in private. And certainly in the Saudi case, those waiting in the wings to take over from the Saudi royals would be 1,000 times worse for women than the Saudi royals, who proved themselves actually fairly progressive. But there's onion layers to this, all right? By not criticizing the Saudis, not taking them to task, we also enabled a very large Wahhabi missionary effort that has gone to places like Indonesia, like Uzbekistan, where there was a milder form of treatment of women that was considered Islamic, and has turned those societies towards a more hardline approach to women. And that is lamentable, absolutely lamentable. It's also true that open support for women's issues is often seen as the worst type of intrusion, as completely culturally insensitive. And we often put women in danger. You may recall in the fall of 2015, the Taliban retook Kunduz for about a 3-week period of time. When they came into Kunduz, they had lists of women to find and to kill. Who were those women? Those were the women who had participated in USAID and the State Department and even the Defense Department's empowerment programs for women. Okay? So to what degree, in trying to empower women, are we then responsible for their deaths? Thirdly, it's also true that sometimes when we break things, we break it worse for women. Ask an Iraqi woman how the invasion of Iraq played out for them. And they will tell you they lost 100 years of progress by the American intervention in Iraq. Were we not thinking of how Iraq could rebuild if women are the foundation of peace and security in the society? And it's true, we have issues of hypocrisy. Paid family maternity leave, that's an issue. We're now down to 19% women in the US legislature as a result of our most recent election. We've never ratified CEDAW, probably never will. It's also true that in interviews we found that gender had become a pet rock. Everybody mentioned women. But when it came time to have hard targets, they weren't there. For example, Secretary Canary had to be shamed into including women in the ill-fated Syrian peace negotiations. We didn't even have any women on the American team, let alone insisting on women on the Syrian team. So hard targets is an issue. And frankly, a lot of our implementers ended up being the worst sort. As you know, USAID contracts with very large contractors who contract with subcontractors who contract with subcontractors. And by the time you get to the ground level, we found there were people who were supposedly implementing gender empowerment measures who were not just visiting brothels, they were running brothels. So there's an issue down the line of implementation. So to end, what types of questions should we be asking? Let me just name a few. What does a state foreign policy that takes women seriously even look like? For example, this is pertinent to our situation right now. What is US responsibility toward the women of Afghanistan? What does, shall we say, a jus ex bello doctrine look like that takes the situation of women seriously? And given our experience over the first 15 years of the 21st century, what recommendations arise? What should be on President Trump's to-do list, and how do we get him to listen? So, my last concluding thought. Over the many years that I've studied these issues, I have become convinced there cannot be peace between nations until there is peace between men and women. And the roots of many of the things that we value in our society, such as democracy and human rights, those roots are to be found in the character of the societal relations between men and women, the two halves of humankind. Which means that what we're going to discuss today is one of the most important discussions we can have. So, let us begin. Thank you very much.